I'm Sue. I'm live in Southampton, south coast of England. And my first Quaker ancestors I'm going to talk about here are Thomas Nichols and his wife Joan Godden, who lived in Folkestone in the 17th century. Bit of background about Folkestone. Today, it's a huge town, busy maritime port, seaside resort, population of around 50,000 people. It's also been a cross-channel port, and now the Channel Tunnel is situated just outside Folkestone. But wind the clock back 375 years, and it was a completely different picture. It was a small fishing harbour, market town. Population was about 600 people, which around 70 were fishermen, main occupation of the actual town. No maritime facilities, though possibly they had a small jetty. But in those days, the boats were just taken out the water, pulled up onto the beach, and the houses of the townspeople were built on the cliffs above the beach. The surrounding town area around the town was farmland, so there was a plentiful supply of food, nice countryside, which would have supplemented the fresh fish, which were obviously caught. And the River Pent, which rises in the South Downs, enters the English Channel at Folkestone and was an important source of fresh water for the whole community. So a nice place to be, but a small fishing village, basically. There'd been settlements there in Roman times, Anglo-Saxon times, and Viking times, as well as after the Battle of Hastings. But these have been long disappeared into the sea, any remains, because coastal erosion's nothing new around there. The parish church, which dates back to 1138, but has been much rebuilt since, actually still stands up on the cliffs. In the 12th century, the town of Dover, which was about 8 miles to the east along the coast of Kent, was designated as one of the Cinque Ports, which was a medieval setup, which meant they, in exchange for the people of Dover providing the crown with a number of ships in time of trouble, they had various rights and privileges, which actually was much to their advantage. It gave them a degree of self-government, legal and financial advantages. Folkestone wasn't one of the original Cinque Ports, but it was included as a limb of Dover around 1313, which meant also they had to supply some boats, but they gained these privileges and were entitled then to have a mayor, a bailiff, and 12 jurats or municipal officers elected by the town. So they were pretty self-governing. Now, Thomas, who was my 7th great-grandfather, was born around 1614, although no records being found. His family may probably have come from one of the surrounding villages or seaports around the coast. I don't know the name of his father, but his mother was called Catherine. He's always described as a mariner and fisherman. And if it's described as a mariner, it normally means that he was a boat owner. So he would have owned his own craft. When he married Joan Godden on the 5th of June, 1638, he was in his mid-20s. Joan was the daughter of Daniel and Margaret Godden. She was baptized in the church at Folkestone in 1623 and had at least one elder brother, John. Her mother died when she was very young. Her father, who had actually been, he was a mayor and a jurat at Folkestone in his time, he died in 1636. When Joan married in 1638, she was 16 years old. She and Thomas were married by license in the Church of St. Margaret at Canterbury with the consent of her 17-year-old brother, who was her guardian. So it was just the two of them against the world by the sound of it. Thomas and Joan had at least 5 children born between around 1640 and 1661. There was a lot of gaps in the records. Possible other children were born and died in infancy. But as the English Civil War began in 1642, just after the birth of probably their first child, Thomas, records became fairly patchy. So it's not surprising if some births and deaths did slip through the net. The son Thomas was born at some time around 1640. There's no record of his being baptized. His birth was followed at irregular intervals, very irregular in some cases, by 3 sisters. Sarah, born in 1641, Catherine, born in 1652, so virtually a 10-year gap, and Mary, born in 1654. Finally, in William, in 1661, their youngest son, William, was born. He was my 6th great-grandfather. It would seem war didn't greatly affect Folkestone or Kent coast. There were battles at Maidstone and Canterbury inland, but it looks like there was nothing much going on along the coastal areas. In the early 1650s, the fighting ceased. 1652, Oliver Cromwell took over as Lord Protector. But in the early summer of 1655, the lives of Thomas, Joan, and their children changed forever. Because that time, 2 early followers of George Fox, who were called, hello, did I not put down who they were called? I can find that out in just a minute. Yes, I've got them hang on somewhere, but anyway, I'll carry on for the minute. They were sent by George Fox to bring his message to Kent, preached in Dover, and then came down the coast to Folkestone. Thomas and Joan welcomed them into their home and were convinced, becoming the first Quakers in Folkestone. And I've got an excerpt from a document from the Kent Record Office saying, so they came to Folkestone, where they were kindly received by Thomas Nichols, his wife and others, and several good meetings they had there, whereat many were present, and the witness of God was truly reached in some, and some were convinced of the truth, and received it in the love thereof. Hang on just a second. I think they were called William. There we are. They were called William Caton and John Stubbs, and they'd been with George Fox in London. He wasn't well at the time, so he sent the 2 of them down to convert Kent. George Fox actually did visit Kent later the year and toured the South Coast towns. And so it's likely that Thomas and Joan would have met him at some point on his travels. But Thomas and Joan were closely involved with the organisation and worship of the local Society of Friends for the rest of their lives. The first entry in the birth records for the Folkestone that we found was that of their youngest son, William, my 7th great-grandfather, born in 8th month, 1661. And the next entry was Daniel Nichols, who was the son of William's elder brother, Thomas. And then after that, it was William's own children. Now, it's possible there was an earlier book or record that hasn't survived, and that all these entries were put into the new book by William, who by then was a leading light in the Society of Friends. But I don't know. I don't have any confirmation of that. The first entry in the burial register was that of their daughter Sarah, who died in 1660, though her place of burial isn't known. And again, it was possibly put in posthumously at some point. The Friends only purchased a burial ground in the 1670s, so I don't know where Sarah was buried. But it wouldn't have been in the Friends burial ground. The early meetings for worship were often held in Thomas and Joan's home, and it was some years before a meeting house was built. Now, to be a Quaker in the 17th century wasn't an easy decision or an easy route. Persecution was especially bad, and imprisonment was not uncommon. In 1660, Thomas and 5 other men were put in jail for 12 weeks for refusing to swear an oath, which meant presumably hardship for the family, as he wouldn't have been able to go and fish for that 12-week period. So times may have been hard for them. 10 years later, Thomas was again imprisoned when he was having a meeting for worship at his house, and the majority of the members were arrested. and carted off to jail again. In 1670, their son Thomas, shown as Thomas's son Thomas, was married to Mary Homwood. This was a Quaker ceremony. He and Joan were present and among the list of witnesses on the certificate. Thomas and Joan were both active all through the 1670s. They visited members, witnessed documents. They represented Folkestone meeting at the monthly meetings held about 7 miles away at Swinfield, and they were on the subscription list for the purchase of the burial ground. Thomas died in early March 1684, was buried on the 16th in the Friends burial ground in Folkestone, leaving Joan a widow. He'd made a will shortly before his death, left bequest to Joan, sons Thomas and William, and daughter Catherine. By 1684, Folkestone had its own meeting house. 1685, youngest son William married Rebecca Greenleaf in Friends Meeting House in Dover, which is where she lived. Whether the courtship was done by boat or by probably a fairly bad road along the coast, I don't know, but I rather feel that William may have nipped into his boat and gone up and done his courting from the sea. Now, this is where I got really thrilled, because permission was needed from the parents for the couple to marry. It was brought before 2 meetings, and they had to give a permission from the parents to say that, you know, that their parents gave their blessing on the marriage. Thomas by now was dead, but Joan signed a document giving her permission for William to marry. She was obviously unable to write and made a mark against her name. And actually, I found the document, the original, in Kent Record Office. And it was quite a moment, because I sat holding this piece of paper in my hand and thinking, my 7th great grandmother actually held and put her cross on this piece of paper. And it was a real link down the generations and the centuries. And it was a really thrilling moment, I must admit. Joan lived long enough to see many of her grandchildren born and brought up as Quakers. She died on the 10th of April, 1704, at the age of 82, and was also buried in the Friends burial ground in Folkestone. Now, many of Thomas and Joan's descendants remained Quakers right up to the 20th century. So the continuation went right down, and some of them actually went to America and remained as Quakers in America. Sadly, today, the meeting house and the burial ground no longer exist in Folkestone, and the few remaining Quakers in Folkestone either travel to Ashford for meetings or else hold house meetings for worship. And that is the story of my earliest ancestors who had a contact with George Fox.
Very good. Thank you. I heard you mention Ashford there at the end, and I wondered at what point, I mean, because I have, by marriage, I think you know, some Nicholses in my family, but they were all centred in Ashford. Ah,
yes, but Nicholses were, because my, was it 3rd great grandparents lived in Ashford. I can't remember what they were they drapers or something? So that was Daniel and Hannah, I think. Yes, so they did move to Ashford, and they also moved to Reigate. Nichols, Thomas Nichols was actually a postmaster in Reigate, and he and his 2 wives, both called Elizabeth, had lots of children, including my 2nd great grandmother, Margaret Nichols, who married Samuel Knight, which is where the Knight bit comes in. But yes, so they stayed and flowed around various bits of Kent, and certainly a couple of them went over to America. So yes, I don't know quite which bits of yours, but I'm sure we tie in, because the Nichols family is spelled Nickalls.
Yeah.
After you know, that they sort of formalized it to that way of spelling it after all sorts of ways of spelling it in the very early days.
Yes.
So I'm sure, yes, we are related on that.